All right, let's take a look at whole blood. Whole blood is made up of two main components called plasma and formed elements. Plasma is a fluid in which the formed elements float. The formed elements are the cells, the leukocytes, the thrombocytes, the erythrocytes. Each blood cell, whether it's a red blood cell, also known as an erythrocyte, white blood cell, also known as a leukocyte, or platelet, also known as a thrombocyte, performs a different function. Red blood cells are known to carry oxygen, white blood cells have an immune function, and platelets help with blood clotting. If we want to see all these components, we could just spin blood, take a blood sample, put it in a centrifuge to kind of speed up the process of separation. Even if left alone, these products would separate out all on their own because blood is a suspension. What would be at the top after you spin blood is plasma, which is the largest component of whole blood. It's 55% of whole blood, and it's at the top because it's the least dense component. It doesn't weigh as much as the buffy coat or the erythrocytes. The other major component is the hematocrit, or the amount of red blood cells, which is about 45% of whole blood on average. It's at the bottom again because it's the most dense component. And in between is the buffy coat, made up of leukocytes and platelets, but that's less than 1% of whole blood. So again, plasma is the non-living component. The living component, or pseudo-living component, is the formed elements, which are the three cell types. The reason I say pseudo-living components of blood is white blood cells are the only complete cells when we're looking at types of blood cells. White blood cells still have their nucleus and many of their organelles, plus other specialized structures. Whereas erythrocytes, they don't really have a nucleus. They don't have many organelles because we want to make sure that a mitochondria doesn't use up the oxygen that an erythrocyte carries. And platelets are just cell fragments with some chemicals inside. So the cell component of whole blood is called the formed element. That's probably a little bit more true than saying it's the living components of blood. You can actually separate the white blood cells, which include the monocyte, which could become a macrophage, lymphocyte, neutrophil, eosinophil, and basophil, into two different categories. You have one category where we have very obvious granules in the cytoplasm of the cell. So the granulocytes are the neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Whereas the agranulocytes do not have granules that are very obviously in the cytoplasm of their cells. They include monocytes and lymphocytes. We're going to take a closer look at the white blood cells here in just a moment, but first let's talk a little bit more about red blood cells. Red blood cells carry oxygen. They can carry carbon dioxide, but they're primarily going to carry oxygen. Their shape is a biconcave shape where there's an indent on each side, and that ensures that nowhere in the cytoplasm is too far away from the plasma membrane. That's going to speed up exchange, both the intake and exchange of oxygen. What's inside of a red blood cell is a protein called hemoglobin. It's actually a really large protein complex made up of 4 different protein globulins. And then in the center of each one of those globulins is a heme group. And each heme group has an iron in the center. So for every hemoglobin molecule, you can put an oxygen molecule, which is called O2, on each iron of a heme group. So one hemoglobin molecule could actually carry 4 oxygen molecules. And there's thousands of hemoglobin in just one blood cell and billions of blood cells in the human body. So the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood is quite high. All right, now let's take a closer look at our white blood cells. We want to talk about what do they do, what's some general information about them, and also about how abundant they are, or which ones you can find in nature the most. We want to categorize them, and we really want to look at their nucleus shape. So let's start first with the basophil. Here's 2 images showing the basophil. It's this middle cell. It's going to be relatively spherical, but you're not really going to be able to see the nucleus because it has dark purple staining granules. The granules are so dark purple that it's going to be hard to see the multilobed nucleus that usually has a rough U or C shape. The basophil is also hard to find because it's the least abundant white blood cell. So when you're looking for it in a blood smear, it can evade you. These granules that basophil have contain histamine or heparin. Histamine is the one we're most interested in. It acts as a vasodilator. So it can act during an allergic response and dilate blood vessels and help other white blood cells and blood and other factors get to the site of an infection. The basophil is also an example of a granulocyte, so it has obvious granules, and again, those contain histamine and heparin. Heparin actually aids in blood clot formation. Next, we're looking at the lymphocyte. Lymphocytes are agranulocytes. There's two different types of lymphocytes, and those are T cells or B cells, also known as T lymphocytes or B lymphocytes. Lymphocytes can also become natural killer cells, and all of these play a major role in the adaptive immune system that has a specific method to go after different pathogens or things that cause disease. It's also the smallest white blood cell, and even though it has no visible granules, it is able to take up most of its space with its large spherical nucleus. But you should still see, even if it's barely visible, a lighter color in a slight crescent moon shape, and that's its cytoplasm. It has little cytoplasm compared to its large spherical nucleus. What about the neutrophil? The reason it's called a neutrophil, or sometimes a PMN, polymorphonuclear lymphocyte, is because it has both a neutral absorption of dyes, both acidic and alkaline, and it has many lobes to its nucleus. So it has a single nucleus, but it has multiple connected lobes, anywhere from 3 to 6 lobes. It's the most abundant white blood cell in blood, and it tends to chemically migrate toward an infection site. It can move from blood into tissue, and there in tissue it acts as a specialized phagocyte where it can engulf bacteria. It also can use lysozymes to digest cellular macromolecules and cell debris to really help clean up the site of infection. It often dies fighting, so it's not the best phagocyte, but it's a very good phagocytic white blood cell. The best phagocytic white blood cell is the monocyte. When a monocyte gets to the site of an infection, it actually leaves the blood and moves into tissue. After a couple of minutes to hours, the monocyte can actually transform into a macrophage. A macrophage, or a slightly different type called a dendritic cell, are voracious phagocytes. They can kind of plow through bacteria and cell debris and clean up an area. And they're great at activating the adaptive immune system by going back into the body, usually via the lymphatics, kind of being sucked up by those lymphatic vessels that are in the body, and then making their way to a lymph node to activate lymphocytes. Now, these are usually present in quite large numbers. They're not going to be nearly as present as the neutrophils, but they are going to be very important for fighting off infection. They release chemicals called cytokines and chemokines, but they do not have granules. They're an example of an agranulocyte. And then last but not least, we have the eosinophil, which is pretty identifiable because using an acid stain, it dyes its granules red to pink colored. It has a bilobed nucleus, so you're going to see kind of a light pink to red with some purple because it uses right stain. It's very active during allergic infections, but it's probably most known for the fact that it helps fight off parasites like worms. So it can help kind of break them down. We often find these in connective tissue, but they're definitely in the blood, and it may be hard to locate its bilobe nucleus because it's just the most common. Occasionally it might look trilobed or may appear U-shaped in a blood smear. So keep that in mind when you are looking for eosinophils. They're definitely going to be present in a somewhat abundant amount, but not as much as neutrophils. Again, neutrophils are the most abundant, and eosinophils are going to be less abundant than neutrophils. And none of the white blood cells are the least abundant as much as basophils are the least abundant. So that's a quick look at all of the white blood cells. If you want to note which ones are the most abundant to the least abundant in order, we can do that. Put a sticky note here. You want to remember the phrase, never let monkeys eat bananas. Never let monkeys eat bananas. And this is in order from most to least abundant when it comes to the white blood cells. So neutrophils are the most abundant, and basophils are the least abundant, with lymphocytes, monocytes, and eosinophils being in between. So that's one way to remember which one's the most abundant, which one's the least. All right, and last but not least, we don't want to forget the platelets. Platelets help with blood clotting, and platelets come from a really large cell called a megakaryocyte. You would find the megakaryocyte in your red bone marrow, but this cell can't get out of the red bone marrow. Instead, it extends these precursor extensions that contain chemicals, and they get shredded off by the sinusoidal capillaries that are next to the bone marrow, and those are kind of like cheese grater capillaries. And that produces platelets that actually get to enter the blood. Here we can see a picture of a blood smear. What you're seeing mostly are these red blood cells. Remember, they're really thin in the middle, which is why they kind of look like pink donuts. But the arrows in this image are pointing to these small, purple, sometimes gray in color, cell fragments. These cell fragments are platelets, and they contain chemicals like ADP and serotonin, other chemicals that aid in blood clotting. And the process that clots blood is called hemostasis, where after a vessel injury, you get slight contraction to slow blood flow, and then we get platelet plug formation, which is a positive feedback cycle that makes platelets sticky until we get a fully formed platelet plug. Then we get a fiber called fibrin that really strengthens that plug. So that's a quick look at all the blood cells and at whole blood. Don't forget that whole blood is the term for plasma plus formed elements. That plasma is the fluid and formed elements are the 3 cell types. That white blood cells are the only complete cell. They can be categorized into 2 groups, one with and one without granules. And make sure to review whether or not the granules do something in the white blood cells. What is the cell's shape? And what is the general granule color? And especially what is the nucleus going to look like? And last but not least, review function for all of the white blood cells. And so make sure you look over all this material, and there's more in your course.